So this is our last controversy, and talks about the Boomer generation, which was a group of all the people born between 1946 and 1964. Roughly about 77 million of them, and kind of they came in two waves. And depending on how we represent these boomers as a group, we're probably likely to come to different conclusions about what it'll mean for this large group as they move into later life. So we need to ask the question, who are the boomers? Generation can refer to people who were born in a certain time period or people who are a certain age at a single point in time, although this is usually referred to as a cohort. So we have this age period cohort model, which basically is a group of individuals who will be influenced by each of three different factors: age, the period, and the cohort. So, what is a generation? Well, generation has different aspects to it. One of them, obviously, aging effects. So there's that physical process of aging, and there's some social responses to those aging processes. Uh, I can't run marathons like I used to, and as a result, I don't have an opportunity to see the people that I used to do that with. So that would be a social response. We're going to be talking. We've talked about the biopsychosocial model, so that would be an example of that. Uh, Another thing that defines a generation are period effects. And so during World War II, everybody, no matter what their age, was impacted by that war. Vietnam, probably the same. The assassination of Kennedy, 9/11, all of these significant events affect everybody at the same time. So it doesn't really matter what age you are. You may respond differently, but the impact is there. And then there's such a thing known as cohort effects, and that affects different groups of age groups of people um, during the same time. So I think the older cohorts may have thought, well, this is Pearl Harbor all over again when they watched 9/11 on TV, whereas someone much younger would not have that sense at all about it. So those are the three effects that kind of define generations. Going a little bit further, the boomers, this 1946 to 64 group, uh, probably because of the war, was the largest generation or cohort that we've ever had before or since. Although I remember hearing on NPR, I think it was a few weeks back, maybe a couple months back now, that the millennials now are the largest group in the United States. So they've taken that place. And typically, boomers had higher levels of education um, across the board than their parents did and grandparents did. Part of that was, a big part of that actually, was due to what was known as the GI Bill. And so when soldiers returned from World War II, they were given a number of different benefits, and one of those was educational benefits. I used them. I wasn't in World War II. I'm old, but not that old. But I used them later on. You could buy a veteran could buy a house with no money down using the GI Bill. So education was a big piece, and lots of veterans took advantage of that. And people like Tom Brokaw praise this group as actually the greatest generation, um, because they in the 60s we really changed the fabric of America, and or began that process. It's always going to continue. There's no end to this sort of thing, um, but we had quite a bit of social upheaval, especially during the Vietnam era, uh, to push for rights for women, for minorities, for both religious and ethnic minorities, and it was a quite an interesting generation to grow up in. I will tell you that I am not a baby boomer. I'm part of the generation prior to boomers, um, which tells you that I'm old. And any gerontologist who tries to lie about their age probably should not be a gerontologist. But anyway, um, so um, the social construction of this whole phenomenon, examples of many of the aspects of human reality that are constructed. So the punchline here is that social life is constructed, and meaning making is in kind of an ongoing negotiation between people. Meanings are subject to change and transform essentially as our beliefs change. Continuing this discussion, we weren't the only country to have a boomer generation or phenomenon, and it happened across the globe when soldiers in Europe went home and soldiers in Asia went home from the war. Um, the birth rate dramatically went up across the planet. So it's not just, and it's important, I think, to think about this, not just an American phenomenon. Um, Oftentimes, boomers are portrayed as a selfish, negative, idealistic group, and I think some of that is absolutely true, and I think it's in great part due to the fact that it was such a large group of people who realized they could change the way the world worked, and have. And so as boomers enter into uh, older years, and then 2011, the boomers started turning 65. 10,000 a day have been turning 65 and since that time, and that'll go on for another 13 years until the whole generation is into elderhood, if you want to define it as someone who's 65. Um, so it's interesting to note that almost 80% of, actually more than 80% of boomers plan to work into their retirement years, and it's probably interesting to kind of look at some of the reasons for that. That's what they say they're going to do. In reality, it's usually a smaller number of people who actually do work into their retirement years. And so overall, we're really not able to be certain how society and government, let alone these individuals, will respond to the changing circumstances of the future, and they're changing more rapidly now than in, at any other time in history. We've talked a little bit before about how knowledge is just growing at an exponential rate. Um, there are so many more things to consider. The planet is much more complex. There are a number of different factions out there that would like to change the way life is. Financially, we're not in the same situation, as good a situation, frankly, as we were after World War II. After World War II, a guy with an average job could buy a house and a car, and his wife didn't have to work, and it's different now. We didn't really have huge student loans, things like that. So this is a very interesting generation to consider all the things they've done and the changes they've affected, and I'm very interested to see how their impact is in political issues, in social issues, financial issues, as we go forward.